Hi, Mike Kirkpatrick here. We're in a series called Why Does a God of Love Allow Suffering? And we've reached chapter 5. And the title is Where Did Sin Come From? And so I want to take just one chapter to explain where I'm coming from in regards to this series. So the Bible tells us if we lack wisdom, it's in the book of Hebrews. If we lack wisdom, to ask God, and He will give us wisdom. And so this question was really bothering me, and I just made it a matter of prayer and asked God, why do you allow suffering? Why do you allow these terrible things to happen? And it seemed like just rather quickly, God spoke to my spirit, and He asked me a question which didn't answer my question. He said, where does sin come from? Well, I didn't have a good answer because I hadn't thought through a lot of this. So my conclusion now is that sin came when Adam and Eve and Satan and the fallen angels all made bad decisions. But that question launched a search on my part. And that search led to many, many questions. And I want to give you a background on what was going on in my life at the time. This was 1994, and that year there was a terrific earthquake in Los Angeles. The 1994 Northridge earthquake, magnitude 6.7, at 4:31 a.m., January 17th, 1994, a hidden fault lurking under the city of San Fernando Valley neighborhoods unleashed a magnitude 6.7 earthquake that shattered buildings, broke water mains, and ignited fires. So this was all in the news, and this, of course, came across my screen because I paid pretty close attention to the news. But this frustrated me, and I'll get into that just a little bit later, because the big rush was not to understand how to prevent this, but how to build back and get traffic flowing again, people to work again. We'll get into that in just a minute, and I'll give you another website. By the way, if you want to follow those events, they're well recorded at YouTube, and just look up the 1994 Northridge earthquake. I'll put that in the description below. Now, on the local scene, things were also happening, and I had a very sad situation that came into our lives at the time, not personal but related, and it was a traffic accident which was just horrendous. Rather than try to rely on memory, I would like to read a forward from this little booklet. When this question came up, I began to write this little booklet. It's just 40 pages, and I want to make that available to you by ebook. If you're interested, you can respond in the comments below, and then try to get you an e-copy of this booklet. At any rate, this is the forward from that booklet, and let me just rehearse this for you. And I'll just read it. It was a normal Friday afternoon. My assistant and I were returning home after a busy day. As a country pastor, I wanted to settle down for another weekend, putting a few touches on my message for Sunday. Traffic jam. Hey, I moved out here from the big city to get away from those things. The road was blocked in both directions, and it was miles around. I got out of the car and made my way toward the scene of the accident ahead. A helicopter was in the middle of the intersection. Obviously someone was hurt. I wondered if I knew them. Then the realization. I recognized the car. My heart leaped. The top had been opened like a can of sardines. A ground ambulance was just pulling away. The helicopter took those critically injured. 3 little boys, 18 months, 3 and 5 years, along with their mother, were in the car, less than a mile from their home. The brakes had failed and the car rolled into the blind intersection. The 1-ton truck was unable to stop with such short visibility. The helicopter lifted and we headed for the hospital. The father would arrive at the scene on his way home from work a few minutes later. There he would get just enough information to realize his life would never be the same again. And now he was en route. The scene at the hospital was emotional chaos. The doctor came in to explain the gravity of the situation. The older boy was rushed off to the big hospital because there was hope that he could survive. He died later that night. The middle boy was on life support and was not expected to make it. The 18-month-old had minor injuries but was released. The sister 8 was at home with her grandmother. They held off on the funeral long as they could, thinking it would be a double. It was a single. The mother had broken ribs and had to be sedated so she could say goodbyes from a wheelchair. She came to the funeral in an ambulance. Her courage and devotion were the stuff of inspiration. Not much time for grief. From the funeral chapel, it was back to the hospital for the decision to continue or discontinue life support. Not yet. One more night. I've never seen a mother so devoted to her children or a father who worked so hard to provide for his family. What do I say to them? The first funeral was tough, but the second, 4 days later, I was numb. Tears were all cried. All the words were said. What do I say now? Why does God allow these kinds of tragedies? Well, this was the backdrop for me, and with the news of the earthquake, I began to surmise that the situation in California, although it didn't affect me personally, it really touched my thinking, wondering, what are they going to do? Well, the Los Angeles Times says it very succinctly. Santa Monica Freeway to reopen on Thursday. Recovery, the contractor will get $14.5 million bonus for finishing earthquake repairs 74 days early. This was on April 6th, 1994. Los Angeles Times. Reading very briefly, less than 3 months after Northridge earthquake knocked down 2 sections of the world's busiest thoroughfare, Governor Pete Wilson announced Tuesday that the Santa Monica Freeway will open next week, ending frustrating delays and bottlenecks for thousands of commuters. And so here I am, halfway across the United States, but I looked at the situation and I thought, why does God allow suffering? Why do these people rebuild on an earthquake fault line that's been common knowledge for years? So I began to ask some questions. What did we learn? I'm not sure we learned anything. Did we get the warning? No, I think a 6.7 earthquake should be ample warning that we're in a very dangerous situation. What if we rebuild? What's going to keep it from happening again? And what if it happens again? Well, the conclusion I came to is fairly simple. If we rebuild again on this fault line, and it happens again, people will say, why does a God of love allow suffering? Because we never add the human element into it. You know, if you're involved with insurance, you've probably heard the term 100-year floodplain. And insurance companies will insure certain areas of the country for flood insurance if they've had a flood in the last 100 years. Why not an earthquake-free zone where we say it's ridiculous to build, and as the news report said, the busiest freeway in the United States built over a fault line? Where's man's responsibility? Where do we step up and say, you know, we can take some responsibility in this area, and this is where the The real struggle comes with a question: why does a God of love allow suffering? Why do people do dumb things? Why do people throw their lives away? Why do they pursue risky things? Why do they jump out of perfectly good airplanes? Why do they jump off of cliffs? Why do they go bungee jumping? Anyway, if you're into that kind of thing, it's fine. I'm not opposed to any of that. I just realize that we sometimes take risks, and I wonder why. So I want to spend just a little time talking to you about the futility of warning. This book, or booklet if you will, I'm working on the final edition. The booklet is not a book about warning. That would be a waste of time. And there's a good record of that. God warned Adam and Eve, and they didn't pay attention to him. The time of Noah was an interesting time. The world was in great difficulty. That is, a lot of sin and debauchery and a wickedness in the time. And Noah preached and preached and preached and told them that the destruction was coming and that he would provide a way of escape. But no one but his immediate family, his sons and their wives, got on board. Everybody else just laughed and scoffed until the flood came. What good was warning? Not much. No one paid any attention. Jesus warned about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. But the Jewish people didn't heed that warning. Fortunately, many of the Christians of that early church, Christian church, and their faith heard what Jesus said. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. We said, well, that has nothing to do with that. But he did make specific warnings. He told people, if you see this coming about, and that is when Titus, Emperor Titus, cordoned the city of Jerusalem, they had just a matter of minutes, maybe an hour, to get out of the city. He said, if you see this happening, don't go back in your house. If you're in the field, don't return to your house. Just leave from the field. If you're on top of your house, don't go back inside your house. And Jesus warned them. The Christians, many of them believed and left their homes, their families, their position in Jerusalem on the words of Jesus. The Jews, on the other hand, ignored the warning because they didn't accept him as the Messiah, and they took comfort in the temple. The Romans came in and burned the temple and just burned the people up inside the temple. It was a sad story. If you want to read more about it, you can read Josephus. He covers it very well, but it's a very gruesome story of the massacre in AD 70. Paul, through the book of Timothy, warns us about the times we're living in. 2 Timothy 3:3. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, heady, high-minded, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Jesus himself predicted in the last times we'd have an increase of earthquakes, wars, and famines. Some of those earthquakes were under the ocean and created tsunamis. All of these things were warnings, but oftentimes people don't pay attention. Jesus gave this warning, which we've come to find to be very true. Mark 13:8, for nation will rise against nation and kingdoms against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginning of sorrows. I had a friend that used to call me on the phone every once in a while. We'd been friends in the past, and in order to keep the friendship alive, he would call me from time to time. But when he called me, he was usually pretty well down on the situation, down on the news, down on things that were going on in the country, and he would play a game that I called Ain't It Awful? Did you hear about this? Ain't it awful? Did you hear about that? It's terrible. I just can't believe this is happening. So I quoted this verse to him in 2 Timothy 3, In the last days, perilous times will come. He said, oh yeah, he was a preacher friend actually. He said, oh yeah, I've preached about that. I said, well then I've got a question to ask you. If you preached a sermon on this verse or this topic, I said, why didn't you believe it? So many people, in spite of the warning, keep coming up with, well, wonder why this happens, wonder why that happens, wonder what's happening to our nation. And even though the warnings are there, it seems like it falls on deaf ears. Well, let me play what if just for a little bit. As a result of this booklet, and I went to my computer and I started typing this up and got about 40 pages that I could just print on my computer and make a cover and staple it. Couldn't go any further than that. I didn't have any plans to publish it. I just, as you are witnessing, I plan to retire one day and be able to spend some time on this subject because it's quite exhausting if you think about it. So I'd just like to play a little what if. Part of this was my frustration is, what if ministers, pastors, people in the church don't have an answer for why does a God allow suffering? What if they just kind of pass it off and say, well, we'll understand it someday? Now, let me just say this. Christians put their trust in Christ. They put their trust in God. They don't question God about these things. Now, that's not saying they don't have questions. They do. But they still believe that everything is going to be all right in the end, and they believe that God's working for their good. And though they may not understand what's going on, they don't attack God. They don't get upset with Him. That may be for a short period of time when they lose a loved one or some tragedy, as I described, happens. And tragedy comes in most everyone's life. And so, what if God warns and we ignore it? What if God tells us why and we're too busy to listen? In 1994, January, in Los Angeles and that San Fernando Valley, how many of those people completely ignored a 6.7 earthquake and just wanted to get back to work? Just wanted to get their paycheck? What if the giants didn't get on Noah's Ark? What if the Christians escaped the fall of Jerusalem and the suffering that went with it? What if the Jews ignored the warning and took refuge in the temple because they felt the comfort there, and yet that's where they met their demise? What if public officials didn't create a disaster zone like a 100-year flood plan? What if the default, no pun intended, plan was to just go with the crowd, blame God, and face destruction? Well, I believe that as ministers we need to be speaking up for God instead of tucking head and just ignoring the question. In a course of years, ministers have to face this question over and over at funerals, graveyards. But Peter makes this assertion in 1 Peter 4:11. It says, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies. We need to be speaking to this issue because people are hurting. Now, there are agnostics and skeptics, and perhaps atheists, if you want to put them in that category, who see this as a defense against the reality of God. Well, that's their business if that's what they want. But my main concern is for young Christians, new in the faith, not experienced in the Word, not used to some of the ways of God. Maybe they have a minor understanding of a few scriptures and maybe some of the Bible stories, but they really are not grounded. And they have a tragic situation in their life. Somebody very close to them dies, or as this accident I described, some tragedy that just comes out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're just totally devastated. Most pastors deal with that from time to time because these things happen all the time. There's not an exclusive experience. So this is the verse in Hebrews I was telling you about. I'm sorry. This is the verse in Hebrews that I want to mention to you. Hebrews 5:12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. And so we've come to make the gospel so easy, and I'm not opposed to that. It's not a complicated thing. Just believe in the Lord Jesus Christ for salvation. But sometimes we want to make it so easy on people that they never really get into the Bible. They never really search and study for themselves. And so when they go to church and they're not given answers to these questions, they never raise the question. So I would like to just speak up for God just a little bit and ask you some questions that you may or may not have thought out. You may not like this, but God created the world with very specific instructions on how things should happen. God told Adam and Eve what they should and shouldn't do. God created the human race with very specific instructions on how they should live. God suspected they might not listen, so he had an escape plan. He knew the people who didn't listen would need a place to hang out. And if you didn't get it, then you didn't get it. So I asked, and this is the verse I mentioned, James 1:5. If any lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given him. Matthew 7:7, Jesus says this, ask and it will be given you. Seek and you will find. Be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open. During my term as pastor, I was asked to attend a little prayer conference. It was just a 3 or 4 meeting on the weekend, Friday, Saturday, and maybe concluding on Sunday. And I was asked to speak about prayer. And I gave this serious thought and consideration. But in the process of studying for this conference on prayer, God really opened my eyes to a concept. And these are the words of Jesus. Matthew 6:8, therefore do not be like them. He's talking about the Pharisees. For your Father knows the things that you have need of before you ask him. Now let me ask you a question. When you pray, how much credit do you give God for knowing what's going on in your life? Or in your prayer, do you explain all the details to him because he's not paying attention? He doesn't know anything about you, and he doesn't care about you, and he's busy doing other stuff. Maybe playing golf or something. And so when you pray, do you tell all this stuff to God as though he doesn't know? Because the Bible simply says he already knows. So the question is, why pray? Well, if God just answered your prayer, you'd find another reason to find that occurred. I've met people who were in very serious trouble, very serious medical situations, and they would pray and go back to the doctor or the hospital, and the doctor would give them a release and say, we don't know what happened, whatever it was isn't there anymore. And maybe the doctor would admit it could be a miracle, and they just blame it on circumstance. Well, I don't know what happened, and never give God credit. Well, what if we didn't pray, and God never got the credit? Well, I don't think he'd like that very much. And so he decided to do something really interesting. And he says basically this: you pray, and I'll answer. You say, okay, what's the deal? The deal is simply this. The prayer is not because God doesn't know what's going on. The prayer is a marker. It tells God that you're asking this now, in this present time, and now you're expecting an answer. So he can go to work and answer your prayer specifically so that you can give him credit for what he's done. You see, it's a point of reference. Now, let me ask you a question. If you are concerned about why God allows suffering, let me ask you a question. Have you ever asked God? He said if you'll ask, he'll give you the wisdom. Jesus said you, in one place, he said, you have not because you ask not. Now let me ask you the question again. Do you really want the answer? Would you want the answer enough to ask? Would you want the question enough to ask or to seek? And so that's what this little booklet and this study is all about. Why does the God of love allow suffering? And what I did was I asked. And I believe what God gave me is an answer that some people can wrap their brain around and maybe get some comfort for the difficult times that they may be facing. I want to thank you for watching this video, and I trust it's a blessing for you. And if you like it, please indicate so, and subscribe if you will, and punch that notification bell. And if you'd like to have a copy of the booklet, it's free of charge. It's an e-copy. I don't have printed copies right now, but if you'd like to have a copy of that, maybe to share with a friend, just respond in the comments below. And thank you very much.